welcome you all to this second webinar in our Data-centric AI webinar series, where we are going to talk about the data scraping challenge. We can move to the next slide. We're going to start the webinar very shortly. And just to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar, so if you don't want to be on camera, you don't obviously have to put your camera on. We may share some of the content on social media and in other communication channels as well, and would love to promote the content as well in the form of quotes and extracts in future ODI communications. For those of you who are just arriving, if you have a question, do add it at all time in the chat. We want to have a very interactive session, in fact, a conversation around this challenge in data-centric AI. So add your questions in the chat and we'll try to answer them at appropriate times during the next 60 minutes. So we've started recording now, and I think we can move to the next slide, where it's down to me to introduce our esteemed speaker for today, but maybe I just say hello on behalf of myself first. So I am Elena Simperl. I'm a professor of computer science at King's College in London and also the director of research at the Open Data Institute. In this webinar series, we're sharing some of our own work at the ODI around data-centric AI, but more importantly, we're inviting world experts with their own research, their own experience to share key insights and recommendations around building the socio-technical infrastructure, data infrastructure that I hope we agree we need to make AI safer and trusted by everyone. So today, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Lee Tiedrich to the webinar. She is one of the world's best experts, if you can say that. Best expert is probably not even an overstatement, but she's a widely recognized leader in artificial intelligence, data, and emerging technologies. There's many things I could tell you about her and her roles as distinguished faculty fellow in law and responsible technology at Duke University, about her work in the IP working group in the Global Partnership on AI, about her work with the OECD AI expert group. You're going to hear more about it today, as well as her holistic experience about data and technology. So thank you again, Lee, for agreeing to be here. And I'm going to start us off by just asking a general question about the role of data in today's AI landscape. So AI has been around for decades. We've seen this step change with generative AI and foundational models. Why is AI so important? And
well, thank you.
What role does data play in this context?
Well, first, I want to say thank you, Elena, and to the ODI team for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here with world-leading experts doing super important work like ODI in this topic. And to answer the question, data is really critical for developing artificial intelligence systems. I feel like Elena, as the computer scientist, should be explaining this more than I am, but you have a model, a computer program, and the computer program doesn't necessarily learn simply by programming as it used to be a long time ago. And I should say AI has been around for a long time. This is not something that's new. But the way AI models are typically trained is on data. So you need a lot of data to train the AI models. And, really why AI has exploded in recent years is a result of a few things. I mean, the models have gotten better, and through open source, they become more prevalent. the compute power has really increased. So we're able to process data a lot more quickly, and we're able to store data more cheaply. And then also in the internet and social media age, there is just a huge abundance of data compared to what we saw 10 or 15 years ago. So there's a lot of data available to train the models. So, data is really one of the core ingredients. And of course, we have the humans who are making decisions along the way as well. But data is really one of the key ingredients to developing responsible AI models. And it's all about getting the appropriate data for that model.
Great, thank you. And you've already alluded to the fact that something has changed. So while AI has been around for 50 years, now with ChatGPT and foundational models, it is not business as usual when it comes to data collection, to data practices, and so on and so forth. And one of these practices is data scraping. So maybe now would be a good time to
Let me see if
share
I
the
can.
slides and
Yeah.
a little bit deeper into data scraping, what it is and what the challenge actually is, and the sort of solutions that you see there based on your work with OECD, GPay, and others.
Yeah. So, just to take a little step back, it is Elena's good question highlighted. Data is one of the key ingredients for developing AI models. And what we're seeing is that throughout the AI ecosystem, there's this race to get a lot of different data, and data is being collected in a lot of different ways. Sometimes an organization has data, historical data that they're using. We're seeing parties enter into licensing agreements to develop data. We're seeing them collect data through other different sources. And one of the things that we're also seeing that's really become an important way of getting data is what we call data scraping. And we were talking about how to define data scraping. And through my work, one thing that we've seen is it's not really well defined. It generally refers to this practice of collecting data, typically through automated means from third-party websites and social media properties, and using that data to train the models. And data scraping has been around for some time. I'm a lawyer. I have a degree in engineering, but I've spent the bulk of my career practicing law and working in the policy era. And if you look back at the legal cases, there are data scraping cases going back many, many years ago. And I'll talk a little bit about where we are today. But the rise of generative AI, this demand to get more and more data to train the models, has escalated the amount of data scraping and its importance to the ecosystem, and has really kind of raised the question, which is the topic of my talk, on how can we proceed responsibly. So before I jump into this, whoops, I'm trying to change slides. Oh, whoops, let me go back. Just a couple housekeeping items. As Elena mentioned, I work with, I have the honor of being an expert in a lot of different organizations. And I'm making this presentation today in my individual capacity. So I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not representing the views of any other organizations. One thing I will note, and we'll put this in the chat, is I had published a piece in the OECD AI Observatory that I authored. It's a piece I wrote, again, not speaking on behalf of any organization, on how to, the data scraping challenge and how to manage it responsibly. So if you want to learn more, I would direct you there. So, kind of in terms of where we are today, just to kind of help level set, data scraping has been around for quite some time, as I said at the outset, but it really has captured a lot of attention these days by virtue of various different circumstances. I mean, one, as I said at the beginning, is that data scraping has become one of the core means that's being used to collect data to train the generative AI models and other applications. So the scale at which this is happening has really escalated in the last couple of years, particularly with the rise of generative AI. unsurprisingly, as these practices have increased, we've also seen an increase in the litigation and enforcement actions around data scraping. And again, litigation and enforcement around data scraping is not new. You go back a couple of years ago, and there were cases against Clearview AI. You go back a little bit further, they're the LinkedIn HiQ cases. But the amount of disputes around the globe that have occurred in the last year and a half over data scraping has really escalated. And, the bottom line here is you've got innovation going forward on the one hand, and you really do look at the rights holder community and its privacy rights, because data can be just about anything. It can be intellectual property rights. It can be other types of content, material, information. But we are seeing that rights holders are demanding some sort of solution. And currently, particularly in the United States, a lot of these challenges have entered the litigation system. And one thing that we've observed in looking at the litigation is there's definitely sentiment among rights holders that it's not a sufficient mechanism, because litigation tends to be slow, as are the enforcement actions. And what we're hearing from rights holders is that they demand more immediate solutions. So this is all part of the challenge that we face today. And it's not surprising that as we've had these tensions build, trying to promote innovation on the one hand, protect right holders on the other hand, trying to find that happy medium, policymakers are stepping in a major way to try to address this in parallel with the litigation. So, for example, the OECD has done great work with their responsible business conduct codes. The G7 has been doing work on the with the Hiroshima process, with voluntary codes of conduct. And if you look at item 11, it talks about responsible practices around input data. Through the GPay IP committee that I co-lead, we've been working on a project for a couple of years on how can we foster voluntary responsible AI data and model sharing. And then at the country level, we're also seeing different practices or policy initiatives emerge in the United States, where I live. The U.S. Copyright Office, following up on what was in President Biden's executive order, has a pending proceeding on looking at how to manage AI, or how to manage copyright in the AI context. We've seen in the EU AI Act provisions dealing with some of these issues around general purpose AI models. The UK, Singapore. So, it's definitely on policymakers' radar screens. And the one thing, and I'll get into this a little bit more, that as we start to think about, what are the policy solutions, we definitely need to look at the harms that have been voiced by various different groups, but we also need to look at the benefits that data scraping can present. And one of the things that we've seen through the work is that data scraping certainly is being used a lot in the commercial context, but there are all different types of use cases. And Elena can probably comment on this as well, but data scraping is also really important to researchers and the nonprofit community. So, we really have to kind of, as we think about policy solutions, think of it holistically. So kind of the work has really broken down into three different buckets. One is trying to answer the question, and I'm going to turn it back to Elena in a second, what is data scraping? Because it's hard to come up with policy solutions unless you know what you're talking about. And I'll share some of kind of the preliminary thoughts on this. And then the second question is the who is involved in data scraping. What is the ecosystem that we're talking about? Because again, you've got commercial actors, you've got non-commercial actors, you may have governmental actors, but who are we talking about? What are the different use cases? And then what are the policy solutions? So the first question trying to tackle is, what is data scraping? And again, I would encourage the audience to chime in here because we want feedback. So this slide at the top depicts good work from the OECD on the AI system lifecycle. And if you're not familiar with the OECD work, I would encourage you to take a look at some of their great work here. And one of the things that I've been able to surmise through the initial work is it seems like the data scraping begins at the initial part of the of the AI system life cycle. And there is no sort of uniform definition of data scraping, but from what I've been able to surmise is it kind of involves a lot of different steps. And within each step, there can be different variations. So on the one hand, you've got the data collection phase, like how are we actually getting the data from the websites? And my understanding is there are all different types of techniques that you can use to extract the data. Then once you have the data, it may not be in a form that you can necessarily use to train the model. So then you have to go through some sort of pre-processing with the data, and there may be some storage involved. And then you get into the model training, model improvement, and model fine-tuning. So I'll just kind of, and then actually some of what the work is focused on is like, how do we define data scraping? And then I'm going to turn over to Elena for her thoughts. But some of the key characteristics that we see that occur is that typically data scraping today involves automation. I think back in the past, there were some manual ways, but most of what we're talking about is automated ways. This is happening on a large scale. It's that it's much more extensive than what humans can do in the same amount of time. Third is that typically when this is done, the data scraping is happening through these bots, scrapers, without going back and getting express consent or providing remuneration to the data owners. Fourth, that there is this data pre-processing and or storage. And then something that we've observed, and certainly part of the claims that we've seen in the litigation, is that oftentimes the outputs that once the model is trained are similar to the input data, which I think exacerbates some of the concerns that the rights holders have. And this could be personal information. It could be it could be copyright infringement. Some of the cases today claim that what is coming out of the model is copyrighted material that allegedly was used to train the model, or sometimes it's impersonating the likeness. So I'll just kind of pose there, Elena, as the technical person. What do you think about this definition of data scraping?
Yes, absolutely. I teach, among other topics, web technologies, and I also teach data science. Say when we teach this on these sort of topics on a computer science or data science degree, we talk about data scraping as a method to create a data set. And I think one of the examples I use in the lab sheets at the university is I want a data set with all the opening hours of the businesses in my area. So if I want this data set, then the first thing I do is try to look for it and see maybe someone else has collected it. If that data set is not available, then I'm starting to think where that information could be stored. And typically, it is stored on the websites of those companies. So what I need to do first is to have a list of those websites. Now, either I get that list from, say, some sort of digital yellow pages. I don't know if people in the audience remember what yellow pages used to be, but it's a repository of businesses. So I need a list of websites to start from, referred to typically as seed websites. And depending on how complete that list is, I will be able to eventually create a more or less complete scraped data set. So let's just say I have a list of business websites. Then I need to have a look at these websites, typically manually, and then get an understanding of where is it on their website that it is likely that I will find the opening hours. Because each website is formatted in a different way. Each website has a different design and puts their opening hours sometimes at the bottom of the page, sometimes in a menu item somewhere. If these websites would be looking all the same or would be structured all the same, scraping would be much easier. But the general case is there is a lot of diversity. So let's just say now I'm looking for opening hours and I'm thinking, well, maybe if I find numbers on the website, those are potentially opening hours. And then I'm defining a rule in my bot, in my program, to say, give me all the numbers. Then I can go a little bit further and I can say, well, it's actually opening hours. So probably if the number is 32, that's not an opening hour, that's something else. And I keep on refining these rules. And then I write a piece of code, or I customize an existing scraper to grab that sort of information. And I put all this information in what we call a structured format. So let's just think about it as a spreadsheet. So I will have probably the name of the business. I will have to write rules to identify the name of the business as well, but let's just put that aside. And then I have a column set opening hours with data extracted from those websites, and then a link to the website. And then I keep on running those rules, extracting that information from each business website, from my digital yellow pages catalog. And that's the data set. Now, that's done at a very small scale, and it assumes that I know which websites I'm going to look for. When we talk about data scraping in relation to AI, that list of websites is generated much more dynamically by following links. So instead of me having a static list of predefined list of websites, I have maybe a core list, and then I'm following links from those websites to other ones. And I keep collecting that type of information. Now, as Lee was explaining, there's also some pre-processing involved. So I'm creating that spreadsheet, but then actually I realized that some of the websites I have maybe are related to businesses that are not in my area. So I will get rid of those rows in the spreadsheet. Or I decide, well, there's some businesses that whose opening hours or area in which they operate, sector in which they operate are not relevant. So there's a lot of filtering in that spreadsheet that happens after I've collected the information. Maybe we will have a bit of time to touch upon some of the most common crawled okay, let me explain what the crawler is. So the crawler, remember when I said that I have a list of websites and I go through them one by one and extract the opening hours? And when I said in other cases, you just follow links, that process of following the links and fetching the websites that are those links, that's called a crawler. So that's another type of program that basically browses the web automatically and extracts the website. And then I have the scraper for a given website, extracts the information that I need, the opening hours based on the rules. And maybe we can talk about common crawl and some of the most frequently used data sets that are created in this way a bit later on. And I can tell you a bit more about the type of filtering that they do and what that means for AI applications.
Yeah, and that was exactly where I was going to go next. This is just shows why lawyers and computer scientists need to work together, because I think it's really hard to understand the whole situation and what the challenge is without looking at both the legal side as well as the technical side. So, this work, first we were trying to kind of figure out, well, what is data scraping? And it sounds like Elena and I, we have not rehearsed this, reached consensus that, well, these characteristics generally apply within each one of them, like particularly the automation. How is it being collected? How is the pre-processing occur? There are variations. So coming up with definitions can be challenging. And then the next thing we started to look at is like, well, if you're going to come up with policy, what is the policy about? So data scraping, the definition, then who should it apply to? And, broadly speaking, I kind of think of the ecosystem as involving three different types of activities, or maybe I'll add a fourth in there. And an entity may engage in one or more of these activities. So first you have the parties that are actually engaging in the data scraping and in the data collection, and who is sending those crawlers out on the website and to the websites and doing the scraping. Then you have people who are organizations that use the data, that are data users. And again, one organization may fit into both buckets. Then you also have users of the systems that are trained on the data. And then in the middle, which is where Elena was going with this, is we've seen the emergence of what I've called AI data aggregators, of organizations like Common Crawl, Ethereal AI, Leon, and others that are creating these sites of these compilations, I should say, and resources of data. And oftentimes the data included in those compilations is scraped data. And, again, as you start to think about the ecosystem and how to manage it, it's trying to understand it. So I'm going to kick it back over to you in a second. But my understanding is that sometimes these, what I call these intermediary sites or these aggregator sites, they may actually extract the data themselves and store it, or sometimes what they do is just provide links to the data on their site. But maybe, Elena, you can help us understand that a little bit better.
Yeah. So that's exactly true. For data set like this to be really useful in an AI context, you need to have scale. So if you think about the Common Crawl data set, it has maybe 1 billion or over 1 billion websites. So that's a lot of content. And it grows by several hundreds of terabytes of data by week or by month. I don't remember exactly, but both mean the same thing. It means if I'm a small company or if I'm a university, I won't be able to build that sort of infrastructure myself. So even storing that data will be a challenge, and keeping it up to date and continuously browsing the web automatically to keep that data set fresh is going to be non-trivial. It requires storage space, it requires computational facilities, it requires a team who knows how to do that. And then, I mean, specifically for Common Crawl, there's a few interesting, there's this great article from the Mozilla Foundation that have looked into the anatomy of Common Crawl and its history. I'd recommend it to everyone. But the creators of this data set need to make a number of decisions which have huge impacts on what happens with the applications that process that data. So for instance, at the very beginning, if I remember correctly, the Common Crawl creators are decided to collect everything. Yeah, so to provide a representative sample of the web with all its good and bad parts. So I hope people realize just how much bad stuff there is on the web that you would stumble on when you have more than 1 billion websites indexed. There is
And I
content
think even
that is
on that point,
yeah.
there's been, I think it was more Leon, but allegations that some of the data there was, a patient's medical records that somehow ended up out of the doctor's office, but on the web, and
Yeah.
pictures of child pornography. So like there, in addition to intellectual property concerns, I mean, there is some really bad content out there that we just don't want to be training models or being made widely available.
But historically, Common Crawl decided to keep this in because they wanted, their initial purpose was to provide a data set to enable various types of research. So they felt that that intervention would be too heavy-handed. If you want to study certain phenomena, some pleasant, some less pleasant, some legal, some less legal, that are happening in the world or in the digital world, then you need to look into that content. That has changed now. So in the meantime, they have decided that cleaning the data, sanitizing that data in that way is the right thing to do, especially because they see more and more uses of their data in generative AI, in foundational models, rather than, say, social sciences or psychology research, where perhaps some of those questions and analysis of the bad content would have been more pertinent. So for me, that raises very interesting questions about what happens with these sort of resources, which have fueled a lot of research analysis in all sorts of disciplines, not just AI, now that Common Crawl, for instance, have changed their main purpose, and their main application area is AI. For instance, and I'll head back to you, Lee, in a second. We used to take the Common Crawl data set and look at tables in those websites that they are collecting. And tables were important to us because we at the ODI and further afield in areas like linked data and semantic technologies, we are interested in so-called structured tabular data and graph databases and so on and so forth. So we would be doing our own processing, taking the Common Crawl websites as a starting point, and then creating our own web of tables data set that then would be used, for instance, to answer questions about that have a numerical nature in a more precise way. And there's many other researchers and also companies that rely on Common Crawl and Lion and other images data sets to do their work.
Yeah, so I mean, it really, I think, highlights the issue of, there are research purposes, they're being used to train the models, and, how do you manage all of this? And, from a legal policy standpoint, as I said at the outset, what makes this really complicated, and I won't spend too much time on this slide, but the issues that the web scraping has raised cut across a lot of different practice areas and legal fields. Like, for example, you've got issues on transparency and explainability. Tell us what you're doing with our data. Explain how the model's being trained. When you're talking about material that's protected by intellectual property rights, whether it's copyright, whether it is trademark rights, there are concerns being raised about, does that infringe the IP? You've got issues on who owns the rights to the outputs and who's liable for the outputs. There are oftentimes contracts layered in here, so you got breach of contract claims. Oftentimes we're talking about data that may be personally identifiable information, which raises privacy issues when the outputs sometimes generate new personal information about each of us that we don't know. For example, if you amass a lot of data about a patient, you may discover that that patient is prone to certain ailments that you weren't otherwise aware of. And that putting that information out there raises new privacy concerns in addition to revealing the information. The data protection authorities have also been very concerned about the cybersecurity implications. Issues have come up about likeness. This is sort of a close cousin to the privacy and the IP, that it doesn't necessarily replicate an image, but it's in the likeness or style of an individual. It's replicating somebody's voice. How does that get protected? There are labor issues, and this was highlighted by the actors strike, the writers strike, about this phenomena is displacing jobs. There are safety issues. I've had the privilege of working on the Safety Summit reports as a senior advisor on Yashua Bengio's team. And if you look at safety in the reports and how it's broadly defined, it raises some of these IP issues and then consumer protection issues when the outputs mislead people, competition law issues. So, what makes data scraping hard from a policy and legal perspective is it cuts across a lot of different issues. And then you layer on top of that this is not confined to single countries. It cuts across a lot of different countries. And broadly speaking, the laws vary to some degree across jurisdictions. So the question is, how do we come up with ways with policy tools that unlock the benefits, because we want responsible innovation to continue, but that also put the safeguards in place so rights holders are protected, and we protect against some of the harms. And kind of what I've been looking at, in connection working with others, is sort of starting from the proposition that from a legal standpoint, the legal web is very complicated across different fields, across different jurisdictions, and policymakers may continue to look at changing the laws, but that is likely going to be a slow process if that were to happen. And that, not necessarily saying if policymakers feel they should look at legal changes, which again, the laws vary across jurisdiction, they should stop looking at that. They should certainly continue to pursue that. But given the urgency here of the scale at which data scraping has happened, given the amount of disputes, it may be time to look at other types of policy tools that can help put us on a more responsible path forward. So I'll briefly highlight 4 of the policy tools, which again could complement efforts to consider updates to the laws, and these all kind of work together. One is, coming up with data scraping codes of conduct. The other, which builds on some of the GPA work, is looking at model contract terms, then looking at standardizing technical tools, and then looking at raising awareness. And what I thought I would do is just talk about each of them a little bit. So like coming up with a code of conduct complements a lot of what we're already seeing in the policy space. As I said at the outset, the G7 has its code of conduct for generative AI. The OECD is working on codes of conduct. And if you look at, for example, the EU AI Act, it contemplates what they call codes of practices. And one of the potential benefits of having these codes of conduct is it can be a way or a mechanism to promote more harmonization among legal frameworks. For example, privacy laws vary across jurisdiction. The exceptions to intellectual property laws vary across jurisdiction. There are some harmonizing treatises like the Berne Treaty, but like how we implement in the United States exceptions to copyright protection looks at the fair use doctrine. In the EU and the UK, you've got text and data mining exceptions. There are other models in other jurisdictions, and this code of conduct could kind of overlay across different laws and try to create more harmonization. It also has the benefit of trying to come up with a holistic approach to address many of those different legal areas: IP, privacy, likeness, and other issues. It could be used as a mechanism to help clarify exceptions in current laws, like, for example, on fair use, on text and data mining. In the copyright context, there usually is some exceptions for either scientific purposes, commercial purposes, non-commercial purposes, and codes of conduct could help provide a little bit of clarity around that. And then it could also help sort of define, what are appropriate behaviors. As we talked about before, data scraping can be a lot of different types of activities. So if people felt it was appropriate, you could say, well, certain methods are preferable over others. You could address transparency, ways of monitoring, accountability, and it also could give you the opportunity to look at, for example, some of these AI data aggregator sites and say, what are some of the things that we want them to do? What are some of the things that we don't think they should do? So we can all try to move towards responsibly. So that's kind of the idea behind this data scraping code of conduct. And you could have different practices directed to different people in the ecosystem. Like, for example, some of it could be users of the systems that are trained on the scrape data, of telling end users, like, don't tell your end users not to press the system so it's regurgitating copyrighted content. So that's kind of prong one. Then something, and I'll punt it back over to Elena, is coming up with technical tools. Like, for example, in the EU, there are the text and data mining directive, which then gets implemented in the member states. And there are ways that, with, again, certain limited exceptions, that parties can opt out of text and data mining. But as I understand it, there's no standardized mechanism for opting out of text and data mining. And that creates challenges for everybody in the ecosystem. Rights holders have a harder time trying to figure out how to protect their rights. I think it's harder for the systems or the AI developers, because everything is different. So if we could come up with standardized mechanisms, that could make it easier for everybody to exercise their rights. And one of the things that I've heard consistently, really throughout the whole community, is that maybe what stakeholders want is not just this binary choice of opt-in or opt-out, but having conditional opt-in and opt-out that will give you permission so long as you comply with XYZ, which could be limitations on uses. Another thing we're seeing is, because the contracting and as Elena said at the outset, that this is happening on an automated basis, is have automated contracting. So again, the bots can read what the contract terms are. We have standardized contract terms. So people have more knowledge about what they can and cannot do. Have mechanisms that, I'm not saying remuneration is necessary in all contexts, but when it is appropriate, having ways that, remuneration could be provided efficiently that might reduce overhead costs. And then also on the technical side of looking at ways that we can explore privacy enhancing technology, synthetic data, to try to protect some of the more sensitive ways. Because again, we need data to train AI models. We want to have robust, reliable data sets for the purpose. We want to be able to customize AI models for underserved regions, and you need data to do that. And, what is the role of synthetic data, privacy enhancing technologies there? Maybe Elena, before I jump onto the other tools, I'd love to hear your thoughts about your reactions to this.
Yeah, so I have to say I don't know all the details because it is an emerging space. So we see a number of technical solutions around having this more nuanced notion of consent, and encoding that in automated contracting and decisions on whether to crawl or to scrape a certain source. It is not a silver bullet. So technically, we will need more than just technology. We will, so for instance, there's approaches I know of that are changing, for instance, images that are under copyright in minimal ways that we as humans or the human eye cannot really see, but that make it easier for someone further down the line to detect whether that image, for instance, was nevertheless extracted from the website despite the terms of use saying otherwise. But at the end of the day, just like with tools against plagiarism and large language models and text, we will need more than that. We will need that sort of code of conduct. We will need standards and examples of companies that are doing ethical data scraping or they're doing things well. At the moment, one of my questions to you was whether you know of any examples of organizations that are doing data scraping in a better way than we have heard in the last 18 to 24 months. But just to wrap up my non-answer to a very complex question is, I don't think technically we can solve the problem. So automatic contracting requires very detailed computational digital representation of contracts. We know those are more or less possible. I mean, law is complex. Standard templates, even if they're standardized for the human eye, still contain lots of nuance in the language and the context they are applied. So there's some partial solutions, but it's not going to be enough.
Yeah, and that's why I think the thought is, possibly putting together, it's like the whole's greater than the sum of the parts. You've got the code of conduct, you've got technical tools. Things may not be perfect, but if you can get people to agree, we're going to abide by these technical tools, you have standard ways to do it. Each step moves you a little bit closer. And I think given time, I'm not going to start getting into a discussion kind of comparing companies' practices or express any views about any particular company's activities here. But going on to the next slide, I think, so it's also having standard contract terms. I think, yeah, so these can be encouraged in the code of conduct. We've been doing a lot of work on this through the GPAIP Advisory Committee, and I think some of the things that are promising here is, again, part of the solution is, countries are starting to look at this. Singapore, the UK, we've seen standard contract clauses have been effective in the privacy context to deal with lack of harmonization. Already today, there's been a lot of reports of companies entering into license agreements around certain data. And, standard contract terms can be drafted, and I think it's got to be a multi-stakeholder process with policy goals in mind. So again, sort of creating mechanisms to try to encourage the behavior. I won't spend too much time on this, but through the GPA committee that I lead, we've been working on trying to come up with standard contract terms around AI data and model sharing. A lot of this was inspired by my 3 decades of private practice and big law that, doing the contracting piece of this was really complicated. And, I think the net takeaway here, without going into this, and there are links to our GPay work, is that there does seem to be appetite within the community to get people to come together. And how can we come up with model terms that can help people go forward? And I think the idea behind this is that there isn't going to be one magic set of terms that works for every situation, but you create different menus of terms and parties can then choose what they think is appropriate. And then I have to make a plug for the joint project between Duke and ODI. We've been working on a joint research endeavor, and we hope all of you will help us and take our survey, because it begs the question of what should these contract terms look like, both in the data scraping context and beyond. And we've launched this survey, and the link will be shared with you. And what we're really trying to find out is, like, looking at all the different participants in the ecosystem, data sharing ecosystem globally. What do parties want? What type of terms, contract terms, will make them want to share data voluntarily? So we hope to publish this report in the fall, but in the meantime, we're still gathering data, and we hope you will take the survey because we really welcome all of your inputs. And then finally, I think the fourth piece of these policy proposals is raising awareness. Rights holders need to understand what their options are for protecting their rights. Data collectors, data aggregators need to understand what the applicable laws are. What is a responsible ethical path forward? Where do you cross the line? People who then use the data that's been collected or scraped also need to understand the rules. And then I think part of this is also educating AI system users on, what are the limits in terms of how you prompt the system to avoid producing outputs that are going to be unlawful or be infringing. So that's kind of in a nutshell. And these are just kind of preliminary ideas on possible policy approaches, looking forward to reactions, looking for ideas for new issues, because, the promise of the technology is great. We have to safeguard rights, and it's really a question of how do we collectively find those happy mediums that strike that right balance.
Yes, thank you. And we already have some questions that I'm going to pass on now. So there's some questions on responsible data practices, which is great to see people interested in doing the right thing. So one question that we received is if someone is considering using data sets like the Common Crawl and others, how can one understand if the data is fit for purpose and safe to use? That's quite a complex question, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a first crack at that, but then I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, the lawyer in me comes back to, data is data, right? So the question is, what are you designing your system to do? And an example that I come back to is, suppose you're designing an AI tool to help doctors diagnose patients. So it's all good purposes. And you could have two different data sets. One may include men and women, one may include only women. And it's like, well, which one's better? It's like, well, what are you trying to diagnose? If you're trying to diagnose prostate cancer, looking at, a data set that doesn't include women is okay. If you're looking at, things in the more gynecological space, the all women data set is okay. If you're looking at an ailment like skin cancer that affects both men and women, then, presumably, given the nature of the purpose, you've got to, having both genders involved is important. And the things on safety, and then I'll love to hear your thoughts. I mean, I think again, you got to come back to what is my use case. If you're training a bot to recommend movies and the error rate is great, so we all may see a few movies that we don't want to see, but nobody's really harmed. Going back to the medical context, if you're using it in a higher risk setting, then, the margin for error is much, much less. So I think you got to you can't answer the questions in the abstract, but over to you.
Yeah. So I would absolutely agree. So for every data set, you need to make sure that it is representative for the problem that you are trying to solve. Now, when we're looking at these general purpose large data sets that have been created over decades and would require some investment in terms of computational infrastructure and capabilities to say build from scratch, I would mention that Common Crawl as such is not used in its current form in AI. So Common Crawl is a database, a very large database, so hundreds of billions of pages. It is hosted, I think, in the cloud somewhere, AWS, Azure, and you can search online for free and see what sort of websites it contains. When we talk about large language models and other foundational models, they use post-process, so further processed and refined versions of Common Crawl, where they have added, let's just say for simplicity, additional features, additional columns that are very much linked to the format in which data needs to be a training data set for AI. And data sets like the Pile and C4, which you may have heard of, which are based on Common Crawl and are used in many foundational models. They are iterations of this Common Crawl data set that include additional filters and augmentations of the original Common Crawl data set, which essentially is just a collection of websites. How would I ensure that it is fit for purpose? I would go and look at what that data set, machine learning data set was created for. So if you look, for instance, in the repository like Hugging Face, there are tags that tell you, well, this is a data set for machine translation between English and Spanish, for instance. And typically a data set will have some documentation associated with it called a data card, which ideally would also include some limitations. And safety, really, like Lee explained, it depends very much on the context, and each jurisdiction has its own ways of explaining what you then need to do to make sure that it is safe. I have another question here. Who is accountable if a business takes data collected by a crawler and uses it in a product? I'm going to ask you that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, just to kind of circle back here, I mean, the goal of this exercise is, we want responsible innovation. We want to protect rights holders. This is not so much an exercise about sort of saying who's right, who's wrong. We're not judging what anybody is doing. It's really a question of how to create a way where everybody can proceed and, do it responsibly and it's not about finger pointing. And I think, um, I think on the question of liability, I mean, that's like a whole separate session, but I think you've got to kind of look at, I'm a big believer you got to look at the facts of each scenario. What was each person doing? What did they know about the data set? How are they using the data set? For example, if somebody is, is the data set represented as being, publicly available in the public domain? I mean, I don't think, like right now you can sort of come up with abstract rules, but I think part of sort of circling back to the policy solutions is, if you have codes of conduct that can sort of answer the questions and set some parameters about what you can and what you can't do, if you have model contract terms, if you have technical tools and you can build that into the code of conduct about you need to respect these technical tools, you can build that into the contract, then you can start to create some baselines that everybody understands. So everybody has notice on what's permissible, what's not permissible, what's within the realms of these policy tools. And then it becomes a lot easier to say, look, if you've done A, B, and C and you've complied with these things and something goes wrong, either there's no liability, there's less liability, but it gives you a mechanism to better kind of answer some of those liability questions than today, because you come back to, right now, where are we today? Things are in the court system and it's creating a lot of uncertainty and it's expensive to delay that. So can't we come up with better ways to answer those questions and also provide incentives for people to do the right thing? This isn't so much about saying you've done this wrong, we want to come after and enforce you, but we want to show you that this works. And developing these tools is a multi-stakeholder process because you need to understand everybody's needs in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, I will just go back to what I tell my students when we do data scraping exercises on computing and data science degrees. I tell them, look at the terms of use, look at robots.txt, which is this file that tells a crawler what to do, and if the website owner doesn't want you to do that, then maybe you shouldn't.
Yeah.
But it's everyone's responsibility, also going back to those limitations in terms of technology solutions that we have at the moment. So we're coming very close to the end. So just very briefly, there are some questions. Thank you for that on resources for ensuring that the company is using data and AI responsibly. So there's a number of frameworks for technical and non-technical roles, and we're happy to share that when we send around the email summarizing the webinar. Equally, the question about an accessible tutorial for the technical aspects of data scraping. So we'll add some resources there as well. Maybe just one final question for you, Lee, and then I will wrap up. So someone asked about how Creative Commons fits into all this.
Yeah, I mean, look, I know the Creative Commons folks very well. I think incredibly highly of their work through our GPay work. Creative Commons has been participating. I think, they're definitely, I think, an important convener in this ecosystem. But I think when you look at their license agreements, I know a lot of people are using, and this kind of comes back to the survey that Duke is doing with Elena and her team. A lot of people are using Creative Commons licenses, but they were drafted with copyright in mind. And I mean, I'm not saying anything negative about their work. It's great work, but data raises additional legal issues, and oftentimes those license agreements don't address them. So this is not about Creative Commons not being good. This is about, do we need something in addition to what currently exists today? But I feel really fortunate to have been able to collaborate with Creative Commons and others, and hope to continue to do so. And again, think very highly of their work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And here again, for everyone, the QR code and the link to this very, very important survey. Thank you, Lee, for your insights. It's a very exciting space, and we're looking forward to see and hear more about your work going forward. So yes, this is now the end of the second webinar in this series. So as I was saying at the beginning, it is part of our Data-centric AI program, which is all about advancing what we know about how to build more responsible data practices in AI ecosystems. I'd also, okay, there's a lot of movement on the slides, which is great.
Take our survey.
Yes, take our survey, exactly. And I then very much recommend you also perhaps to have a look at our policy interventions, which we have published in the last weeks, which talk about our own ideas and positions around different types of rights in relation to data and AI, as well as how we could empower people to have a greater say in how their data is used in AI training and fine-tuning. If you'd like to keep in touch with what we're doing, there's going to be a link on a slide about that will take you to a mailing list. And just to say, we're not going to have a webinar in August because everyone deserves a break. But we will be back on the 4th of September with another great talk by now Gina Neff, who's the Executive Director of the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy at Cambridge here in the UK. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and for being here. And I hope to see as many as you again in September. Thank you.
Thank you.